Hi, welcome Andrew. I'm excited to chat to you about the ATP and men's tennis. To get things off, you recently started at the ATP or returned to the ATP after, 7 years away from tennis? Why don't you talk to me about what made you jump at that opportunity and lead their global brand strategy and marketing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I spent a lot of my career in tennis. Started as a very junior tennis agent in the early 90s. Spent a little bit of time at the ATP in the early 2000s, about a decade at the WTA, and a few years at the ITF before joining the Pac-12 in college sports. So tennis has been a passion of mine. I think many of you probably know what happened with the Pac-12, but I had intended anyway to be looking to get back into tennis because of the relationships I had built, because I loved the sport. So when the opportunity arose, jumped at it. The ATP, for those of you who've been following it a little bit, they've had new senior management over the past 4 years. They've got a really compelling strategic vision called One Vision. It's all about a real fan-centric approach to the sport, aggregating commercial rights, presenting kind of a unified product to fans, and that's really focused on creating more premium events that kind of draw the top players. So I think the kind of vision was something that attracted me a lot. And part of that vision is specific to the ATP, but kind of the second phase of it is very much about working with other governing bodies, so the WTA in particular, but also the Grand Slams, including Tennis Australia and the Australian Open. So I think it's a really compelling vision for the future. The other thing I'd say is I think it's a really interesting time for men's tennis. Everyone knows, obviously, the Roger, Rafa, Novak era, but right now we've got a whole host of really compelling athletes, Alcaraz, Sinner, a whole host of others, plenty in the US. I think there's 5 US players in the top 20 right now. So from a marketing perspective, that makes it particularly interesting. And I guess the last thing I'd say is I think there's a number of properties like the NFL, NBA, which are dying to become even more global, and tennis is one of a handful of sports that's already kind of naturally a global sport. At the ATP, we're 60 some odd tournaments across 30 countries, and I think that creates a lot of opportunity in terms of growing fan base globally, attracting commercial partners, and so forth.
Yeah, great. You talked obviously a lot about fandom. So can you share some of the initiatives that you're implementing to create that year-round, like 24/7, 365, and how the ATP Tour is attracting actually a more inclusive and broader audience?
Yeah. I guess the first thing I'd say is we just conducted, so I've only been at the tour about 4 months now, but we did do some fan and brand research, and there were a few kind of interesting data points that came out of it that are going to inform our strategy. Tennis has about 1.1 billion fans. About 800 million or so of those are casual tennis fans, so they're primarily following a particular athlete or they're following the Grand Slam. So there's a big opportunity as we think about how we're going to grow audience, grow engagement. There's a big opportunity in terms of several 100 million tennis fans who are not ATP fans. So and a big proportion of those are millennial or Gen Z. We know from the study we just did and other studies that a lot of those fans are attracted to our athletes, of course, and their personalities, not just how they do on court, but wanting to know more about their personalities. We know, of course, that our younger generations are following primarily on digital platforms. About 2/3 of our content that's consumed is non-live content, so not following live matches, but following a short-form content primarily on social media channels. And I guess the last data point I'd cite is about 40% of our fans are influenced to some degree by content creators or other influencers who have an affinity for tennis, which kind of ties into kind of cultural conversation. So our approach is very much about being as inclusive as possible as we think about attracting those casual tennis fans, certainly looking at how we can support our athletes and their own content creation. I know you're going to ask about that. Thinking about how we can do more with influencers. That's a big area. It's certainly not unique to tennis, but I think that's an area that we can and will focus and invest on. So I think those are some of the factors as we think about where we're going to be spending our time and energy to attract more fans to the sport.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually, let's jump to that then. Obviously, athletes are your number one asset. So how are you leveraging and supporting them as an extension of your brand?
Yeah. So for about a year predating my arrival, we've had an athlete marketing program, so a group within my group that's specifically focused on supporting and promoting our athletes. There's really three pillars to that program. One is brand building and brand building support activities. So supporting our athletes in terms of defining their brands, understanding their brands and how best to translate their brands into audience growth and engagement and eventually commercialization. A big piece of that in terms of our support is around creating bespoke content that's aligned with an individual athlete's brands that can be utilized across their platforms and then amplified through our own ATP platforms and partner platforms. So we spend a lot of time and money in content creation on an individual athlete basis. And then the last piece is commercialization in terms of helping our athletes monetize. The easiest way for us to do that is through our own existing ATP Tour partners. So we are always looking at ways in which we can integrate athletes and have our athletes paid into our sponsorships. So that can be kind of traditional ambassadorships based upon NIL. We've got more finite programs. So for example, a player post program, which is more, I guess, non-strategic ad hoc pay for play for a player to support a particular brand through their social media channels. And we're currently looking at how we might be able to do more in terms of group licensing. It's a tricky one because for various reasons, and our athletes are independent contractors, and it's a bit different than team sports. But there are probably some categories, trading cards being one amongst others, that we're going to look at where it could make sense to do some group activities with our athletes.
Yeah, awesome. And on Monday, we talked a little bit about ATP Serves. Can you talk a little bit more about like the sustainability efforts that you guys are doing around that?
Yeah, so our social program is called ATP Serves. There's three pillars to that as well. One is around sustainability, two tied to mental health, and then the third one is related to diversity and inclusion, which is a bit more internal facing versus external for the moment. That program, I think, was launched about 3 years ago. A lot of our partners have been integrated into different aspects of that program. An important piece of it, in addition to kind of the ATP-led pillars that I just mentioned, is looking at ways to support individual tournament and athlete social causes. So that's a big a priority for us, not only to kind of support our global efforts and to commercialize to a certain extent and actually do some good off the back of our tournament environments and our athlete brands, but also to look to, as a membership organization, support our individual athletes and what they're trying to achieve. And it kind of ties back to how we're really focused on athlete support and athlete promotion.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously very important. All right, we're going to go a little bit on the riskier side. We're going to talk about the Saudi investments. In February of this year, the ATP and PIF announced a multi-year strategic partnership to accelerate the growth of global tennis. From a brand and marketing perspective, how do you see that impacting the ATP Tour over the coming years?
Yep. So as most of you are probably aware, PIF has been investing in sport across a number of different sports. They identified tennis as one of their priority sports, so they're investing not only in the ATP but also the WTA, which is interesting given some of the other conversations that are happening about potentially merging commercial operations with the WTA. So again, I've only been around for 4 months, so what I do know is that from the PIF perspective, they're interested in tennis as a platform for health and well-being within their own country. So they see tennis as an interesting investment from that standpoint, and they're interested in bringing events and activities to their home market and content to their home market. They're a primary sponsor of our Next Gen Finals, which is our kind of secondary finals for the best players under the age of 21, which is being held in Jeddah. They're also invested in a number of other tournaments and in our athletes. So what was really important for them was to not just be another sponsor partner from a pure kind of brand awareness perspective, but to be seen and to actually be supporting the growth of the game. And tied into their investment into the Next Gen Finals was a desire to support the next generation of players. So here in New York, they're doing a bunch of educational seminars for our under 21 players. They're investing in technology. So there's, I'm not fully up to speed on it, but there's these vests that kind of gather a lot of personal data. So not for external purposes, but for internally, they're supporting around that investment that will help our athletes from a performance standpoint. So they're looking at the partnership from that perspective in terms of how can they be a supporter of the game, grow the game globally, in addition to achieving their kind of domestic objectives.
Yeah, that's great. And then you talked about, obviously, that now they're partner both the WTA and the ATP. So let's talk about media rights, because obviously it's a big topic. We know the WNBA just had a $2.2 billion deal done. There has been talk about, obviously, maybe next year, the commercial rights and media rights will merge the WTA and the ATP. Can you talk a little bit more about the growth opportunities that you see from that?
Yeah. I mentioned the ATP's One Vision strategy. The first phase of that was focused on the ATP only. So there was a moment in time not too far in the past when we hadn't even aggregated our own commercial rights. So that was kind of step one. We now sell under an entity called ATP Media, which is closely tied to the ATP, all of our media rights for all of our tournaments through a single entity. And that obviously gives us more leverage in the marketplace. It gives us more ability to, from a consumer standpoint, hopefully align how we're presenting the sport from a broadcast perspective in a more coherent way to our fans. So that was step one. The bigger vision, and these are ongoing conversations, first with the ATP, and then hopefully at some point in time with the Grand Slams, which is part of phase two of our One Vision strategy, is to create a commercial entity with the WTA, which would house all commercial rights, including media rights, sponsorship, licensing, as well as marketing, other marketing rights. And I think, you know, what's compelling and really exciting about that is the same reason it makes sense at an ATP only level. We should be able to, very confident we'd be able to generate more revenues through more tonnage, more leverage in the marketplace through a single selling entity, rather than competing against one another. And then again, probably more importantly than the revenues is the presentation point, which goes back to the vision to be a more fan-centric property, to reduce the fragmentation and the confusion in many consumers' minds about how to follow tennis. There's a good example of that. ATP Media did sell on behalf of both the ATP and WTA into the UK market. So Sky Sports now carries both ATP and WTA matches, which has, you know, thus far been quite successful in terms of viewership and a more coherent communication platform to tennis fans throughout the UK. So that's the vision, is really a better product for our fans by joining forces commercially, and more revenue, of course.
Yeah, obviously, and there's a lot of brands in this room. So if there's brands obviously interested in WTA and ATP, that would be great. All right. Well, I think we can open up questions if people have any.
Thank you, Andrew, for speaking with us. You mentioned how you're trying to be more fan-centric and how there's about 7 million casual fans, and also trying to target potentially more millennials and Gen Z fans as well. What's the approach to actually engaging with content creators and influencers, and what guardrails are you putting up to make sure that it's in line and also actually attracting and engaging those fans who
Yeah. So we're building our influencer strategy right now. But for sure, in terms of entities that I've already kind of talking to as that will be part of that strategy, definitely looking at content creators and the platforms upon which they live. So talking directly to the platforms. So Instagram being one example about how we might be able to partner with them. TikTok is obviously another one that's done deals in the governing body kind of rights holder space. So that's one area that we want to explore from kind of a platform partnership level, in addition to kind of looking at individual content creators. The other kind of, I guess, obvious area from my perspective is other sports leagues. There's a lot of natural connections between our athletes and athletes competing in other professional sports leagues and other leagues. So that's an area where we've done some things that have happened naturally and opportunistically, but maybe not part of a kind of coherent, kind of consistent plan. I mentioned the kind of the brand and fan research. We know that other athletes, in particular in the U.S. market, for example, NBA, NFL, not surprisingly, definitely musicians, definitely actors, and then certain kind of individual content creators on certain platforms are areas that should be ripe for collaboration in terms of where we know many of our casual tennis fans have interest from other kind of cultural perspectives. So all that's, I guess, going to be thrown into the mix in terms of how we do a better job of extending our reach and extending the narrative of our athletes beyond kind of the natural tennis platform. So that's probably about it, as much as I can say at this point, but it's a priority for the kind of the reasons behind your question.
Do you guys have any metrics around increase in fandom over the next 4 years? Like, you mentioned 1.1 million fans currently. USDA came up with 35 million player by 2035. Over the next 5-10 years, you guys set any metrics? Talking about 1.1 to
Yeah, have not yet set kind of specific KPIs. That will be probably by the end of this year in terms of what's kind of a realistic stretch goal in terms of how much we can grow our fandom. I would say this, the size of the casual tennis audience, those who are primarily following Grand Slams or individual athletes, is large enough that we don't, and from my perspective, we don't need to spend any time on non-tennis fans. The other interesting piece, or another interesting piece from that research is that even amongst avid tennis fans, there's 28% of those who are not regularly following the ATP Tour. So I think there's a lot of fertile ground very close to home that we just need to do a better job of putting ourselves in the environments where those fans are consuming tennis in a different way. So the end, by the same token, ensuring that the message that we're delivering makes us as relevant and compelling as possible. And I think everything that we're going to do is going to be very athlete driven. I didn't mention to one of the earlier questions, the fact that we're going to have a new global marketing campaign next year, and how we position ourselves. I think it's a big opportunity in terms of how we position ourselves to be more relevant and more compelling to those fans who are attracted to the Grand Slams for various reasons, who might be following an Alcaraz or a Sinner or a Novak Djokovic for individual reasons, but maybe who clearly don't yet have enough reason or understand why it might be compelling for them and should be of interest to them to follow the tour on a more regular basis or to follow more players on a regular basis, but haven't yet set kind of specific KPIs.
I have a follow-up question. You mentioned collaboration with other sports, and I know there can be debate whether pinball is a sport or not. But with that in mind, and that almost serving as a gateway or an entry point for potentially casual tennis fans, is there any collaboration on the horizon on that front?
Yeah, I think that's probably a better question. I mean, I'll answer it, but probably a better question for the USTA, because I think if there's a threat from, in quotes, from pickleball, because you could view it as an opportunity as well, it's probably more on the participation side. And I think Novak spoke about this in one of his post-match press conferences during Wimbledon in terms of the potential threat if we don't do a better job of promoting tennis when it comes to participation. Participation obviously at some point in time impacts the professional game. So I guess from a ATP perspective, I guess I'd be more, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. If I saw some evidence that we could reach those casual tennis fans or those avid fans who are also avid pickleball fans, and there was some connection at that level, then it becomes an interesting area to explore in terms of how we might cross-promote in some way, or maybe cross-promote at an athlete level at the professional, on the professional side. But I haven't yet given it a ton of thought. But I think it's more of a, to me, I think it's a bigger threat on the participation side and potentially an opportunity.
Slightly from Smart Vision. So Andrew, you said that you're putting a lot of effort in content marketing. And with that being said, at a high level, what types of social media campaigns have been most successful in achieving KPIs, driving awareness in general?
Yeah. So I can give you one stat. In the first quarter of this year, looking at ATP only social media platforms, over 50% of our viewership, and I think close to that in terms of kind of engagement levels, was directly tied to collaborations with influencers. So that's a huge piece of it. We've seen good metrics. I haven't looked very far back, but this year we've seen good metrics on a fair bit of, how would I describe it? I guess humor-focused content. So trying to, which is personality-driven content that's performed quite well when done well. Not always, but when done well, I think that's an area that's ripe for kind of further exploration. Match highlights is obviously, that's the bread and butter, and that drives like the majority of our views. Like that goes without saying. I mean, when you look at kind of personality-driven content, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that we should be focusing our energies on telling those stories, and I believe in that. But a lot of it comes down to execution as well. So you can, a poorly executed personality piece is not going to perform well, obviously. So, but that is another area that we're focused on, and kind of in terms of kind of drilling down a bit deeper when it comes to kind of discretionary budget and how we're spending our content budget, our short-form non-live content budgets, we're thinking mostly along the lines of off-court personality-driven content. Yep.
And so one question I have, and I realize it's a tricky one for the future, but because it's always been a very traditional sport in terms of format, stay for long, for steps, for 5 sets. Just thinking in terms of, from a marketer perspective, you return to tennis, what are your thoughts on, do you think that the formats where tennis has been a challenge marketing sector with say or matches may start, so what's your thought on that for the future, plans and marketing?
Yeah, a few thoughts. We do use our event in Jeddah as a testing ground. So the Next Gen Finals has been I think it's still 4 game sets, and there's a few things we've done there, looking at kind of shortening matches. We're doing similar things when it comes to the doubles game. I would say maybe I've been in tennis too long. I think we have to tread carefully when it comes to format changes. I think there are things that are really unique to tennis that we want to preserve. So, for example, it's not my area. Obviously, I don't work at a Grand Slam, but I personally like the 3 of 5 sets. I think it makes it very special and unique at a Grand Slam level to have those length of matches. And there's some benefits from a commercial side as well when you think about kind of broadcast and so forth. I'm definitely a proponent of continuing to explore ways to shorten matches around the edges, but I would be wary of making wholesale changes when I think we can achieve a lot of the same objectives through what we do through our non-live content offering, whether that be match highlights or some of the other things I was just talking about. So I think that to me is very safe ground where we can grow our audiences, where we can commercialize better, where we can attract more fans. And I don't think we need to be personally overly frightened by some of there's benefits and challenges to the sport of tennis. You mentioned some of the challenges, but you can look at a lot of different studies, but there are plus or minus 1 billion fans of the sport. So that's a pretty good base to work off of. And I think there's a lot of opportunity outside of any type of drastic changes to the format where we can continue to grow and grow at a healthy rate for many years to come. That's my perspective. But there's plenty of people experimenting out there, and I think if at a point in time someone is successful in their experimentation, then we can look at it. I don't know if we have to necessarily be at the kind of top level of the professional game, taking the most risk in that area. We can see how others are experimenting.
All right, we're at time, but thank you, Andrew. It was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.